The chandelier above the ballroom flickered, casting jagged shadows across the sea of cocktail dresses and tailored suits. Jeremy stood near the bar, his fingers tracing the rim of a whiskey glass, the ice cubes clinking like tiny alarms. He hated these events, always had, but Jennifer loved them, loved the way people's eyes followed her as she moved through the room, her laughter ringing out like a perfectly tuned bell. Tonight, though, something felt off. The air was too thick, the music too loud, and the way she kept glancing at her phone made his stomach twist. "You're not even listening to me?" Jennifer's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. She was standing in front of him now, her red dress catching the light like a warning signal. Her nails, painted the same shade of crimson, tapped impatiently against her glass. "I'm sorry, Jen," Jeremy said, forcing a smile. "What were you saying?" She rolled her eyes, a gesture she'd perfected over the years. "God, Jeremy, you're so stuck in the past. It's like you're still chasing ghosts from your detective days. When are you going to let it go?" The room seemed to tilt. Conversations hushed, heads turned. Jeremy felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, their stares like needles pricking his skin. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Jennifer's words hung in the air, sharp and unapologetic, as if she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to let them loose. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, the bubbles rising and popping in a cruel imitation of laughter. Jennifer plucked one from the tray and took a long sip, her gaze never leaving Jeremy's. "Honestly," she continued, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's exhausting, living with someone who's always looking over their shoulder, always second-guessing everything. Don't you think it's time to move on?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the music seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of Jeremy's heartbeat pounding in his ears. He glanced around the room, catching snippets of pity and amusement on the faces of the guests. His fingers tightened around the glass, the cool surface doing little to steady him. "Excuse me," he muttered, setting the drink down with a shaky hand. He needed air, needed to escape the suffocating weight of her words. But as he turned to leave, Jennifer's voice followed him, sharp and unrelenting. "That's right, walk away. Just like you always do." The doors to the balcony swung open with a gust of cold night air, and Jeremy stepped outside, the city lights blurring through the haze of his anger. Behind him, the party continued, the noise swelling back to its usual volume. But out here, in the quiet, he could still hear her voice, still feel the sting of her words. And somewhere, deep down, he knew this wasn't just about his past. It was about something else, something darker, something she wasn't saying. But for now, all he could do was stand there, staring at the skyline, wondering when everything had started to unravel. The sound of Jennifer's laughter carried through the house like a knife. It wasn't the kind of laugh she used to have, light, genuine, the kind that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. No, this was something sharper, meaner. Jeremy stood in the kitchen, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter as he listened. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something else, something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit left too long in a bowl. It made his stomach turn. He'd been scrubbing the same spot on the counter for the last 10 minutes, the sponge worn thin in his hand. Jennifer was in the living room, her voice carrying through the open doorway. She was on the phone, her tone dipping and rising in that way it did when she was talking to someone she wanted to impress. Jeremy couldn't hear the other person's voice, but he didn't need to. He knew that rhythm, that cadence. It was Mark, the gym owner, the guy with the 2 white teeth and the biceps that looked like they'd been inflated with a bike pump. "Oh my God, Mark, stop," Jennifer giggled, her voice high and breathy. "You're terrible." Jeremy froze, the sponge slipping from his hand and landing with a wet plop in the sink. He stared at the water swirling down the drain, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel the ache in his teeth. Terrible. She'd called him terrible. Not in a bad way, though. No, it was that tone, the one she used to use with him back when they were first married. Back when she still looked at him like he was something worth looking at. "Honestly, though," Jennifer continued, her voice dropping lower now, conspiratorial, "Jeremy's just obsessed. Like, it's kind of pathetic, you know? He's always going on about his old cases, like anyone even cares anymore. It's like he's stuck in this, I don't know, this fantasy world or something." Jeremy's chest tightened, the air in the room suddenly too thick to breathe. He leaned heavily against the counter, his vision blurring as her words echoed in his head. Pathetic, obsessed, fantasy world. Each one landed like a punch, knocking the wind out of him. He wanted to storm into the living room, to rip the phone out of her hand and demand to know what the hell she thought she was doing. But he didn't. He just stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, listening as she laughed again. That same sharp, cutting laugh. "I mean, come on," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's not even a detective anymore. What's the point of living in the past like that? It's like he's trying to prove something. But to who? Himself." Jeremy's eyes flicked to the hallway mirror, catching his reflection. He looked tired, worn out. The lines on his face seemed deeper than they had a year ago, his hair more gray than brown. He thought about the case files he kept in the spare room, the ones he still pored over late at night when he couldn't sleep. He thought about the way Jennifer used to bring him coffee, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as she leaned over to see what he was working on. She'd seemed interested back then, or maybe she'd just been humoring him. "Anyway," Jennifer said, her voice brightening again, "I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Same time." Jeremy's stomach lurched. Tomorrow. Same time. The words echoed in his head, bouncing around like a pinball. He didn't know what they meant, not exactly, but he could guess. He thought about the way Jennifer had been dressing lately, the new workout clothes, the expensive leggings and sports bras she didn't need. He thought about the way she'd started going to the gym 3, sometimes 4 times a week. He'd thought it was just a phase, something to keep her busy now that Ethan was grown and out of the house. But now, the sound of Jennifer's footsteps made him jerk his head up. She was coming down the hallway, her phone still clutched in her hand. Jeremy quickly turned back to the sink, grabbing the sponge and scrubbing at the counter like his life depended on it. He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't look up. He couldn't. "Hey," she said, her voice casual, like she hadn't just been tearing him apart on the phone. "You okay? You've been in here forever." Jeremy forced a smile, his hands still moving over the counter. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Just, cleaning." Jennifer nodded, her expression unreadable. "Okay," she said, turning to leave. But then she paused, glancing back at him over her shoulder. "Oh, by the way, I'm going to the gym tomorrow morning. Mark's helping me with some new routines." Jeremy's hands stilled, the sponge slipping from his fingers again. He stared at the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. "Right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The gym." Jennifer didn't say anything else. She just walked away, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Jeremy stood there for a long time, his hands gripping the edge of the counter, so hard his knuckles turned white. The smell of overripe fruit filled his nose, making him feel sick. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that Jennifer was laughing about him with Mark, or the fact that she didn't even care enough to hide it. The rain had been falling for hours when Ethan showed up at the house. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by unannounced. He lived nearby, and Jeremy had always encouraged him to treat the place like his own. But tonight, something about the way Ethan stood in the doorway, dripping water onto the hardwood floor, made Jeremy's chest tighten. His son's face was pale, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, his voice tight. He wiped his boots on the mat, but the gesture felt like a stalling tactic. Jeremy had seen it before, in suspects, in witnesses, in people who knew they were about to drop a bomb. "Come in," Jeremy said, stepping aside. He didn't ask why Ethan was there. He didn't need to. The air between them was heavy, like the storm outside had seeped into the room. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped between his knees. He stared at the coffee table, at the half-empty mug of cold coffee Jeremy had left there hours ago. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows. "You okay, kid?" Jeremy finally asked, leaning against the armchair. His voice was calm, but his gut was churning. He didn't like the look on Ethan's face. Ethan exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath. "Dad, I need to tell you something. But I don't." He stopped, shaking his head. "I don't know how to say it." Jeremy's heart sank. He knew that tone. It was the same one Ethan had used when he was 8 and confessed to breaking the neighbor's window with a baseball. Guilt, fear, and a desperate hope for forgiveness all rolled into one. "Just say it," Jeremy said, his voice softer now. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Ethan looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. It's Mom. The word hit Jeremy like a punch to the chest. He sat down heavily in the chair, his knees suddenly weak. What about her? Ethan hesitated again, his fingers twisting together. I saw her. At the Hampton Inn on Route 9. Last week. Jeremy's stomach clenched. The Hampton Inn. He knew it. A nondescript place tucked between a gas station and a diner. The kind of place people went when they didn't want to be seen. She was with someone? Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark. The guy from the gym. The room seemed to tilt. Jeremy gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles whitening. He'd known. Hadn't he? Deep down, he'd known. The late nights, the sudden trips to the gym, the way Jennifer's phone was always face down on the table. But hearing it from Ethan, his son, his flesh and blood, made it real in a way he wasn't ready for. Are you sure? Jeremy asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan nodded, his face crumpling. I didn't want to believe it either. But I saw them, Dad. They were together. The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Jeremy's mind flashed to Jennifer's smile. The one she used to reserve for him. The one she'd been giving to Mark for months now. He thought of the way she'd laughed at the party, how she'd called him stuck in the past, in front of everyone. And now this. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jeremy asked, his voice cracking. Ethan looked down, his shoulders slumping. I didn't know how. I kept hoping I was wrong, that it wasn't what it looked like. But, Dad, I couldn't keep it from you anymore. Jeremy closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion crashing over him. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers from Jennifer. But all he could do was sit there, the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on him like a stone. I'm sorry, Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. Jeremy reached out, gripping his son's shoulder. It's not your fault, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. You did the right thing telling me. But as he sat there, the rain still pounding against the windows, Jeremy couldn't shake the image of Jennifer and Mark together. The betrayal was one thing, but the fact that Ethan had been the one to uncover it, that was a wound Jeremy wasn't sure would ever heal. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of storm that rattles windows and makes the house feel smaller, tighter, like it's closing in on you. Jeremy sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty coffee mug in front of him, the steam long gone. The sound of Jennifer's heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed from the hallway. She walked in, her face all calm and collected, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't been laughing with him just a few nights ago. Jeremy, she said, her voice sweet but laced with something sharp, like a knife wrapped in silk. You've been quiet all day. What's going on? He looked up at her, his jaw tight. The storm outside mirrored the one in his chest. Chaotic, unrelenting. I heard you, he said, his voice low but steady. At the party, laughing with Mark, talking about me. Jennifer froze for a split second, but then she smiled, that same damn smile she always used when she was about to twist the knife. Oh, Jeremy, she said, shaking her head like he was a child who'd misunderstood a simple math problem. You're reading too much into it. You always do this. You're so paranoid. Paranoid. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. You think I'm paranoid because I heard you mocking me? Calling me pathetic? What the hell is going on between you two? She sighed. That heavy, dramatic sigh she always used when she wanted to make him feel like he was the problem. You're doing it again, she said, crossing her arms. You're living in your detective fantasies, Jeremy. It's like you can't turn it off. Not everything is some grand conspiracy, you know? Jeremy clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up, but he forced it down. He'd seen this before, in interrogations, in suspects who thought they could talk their way out of anything. Gaslighting. That's what this was. She was spinning the truth, making him doubt himself. But he wasn't going to fall for it. Not this time. I'm not imagining things, Jennifer, he said, his voice firm. I know what I heard, and I know what I've been seeing. The late nights at the gym, the secretive phone calls. You think I'm blind? She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. You're being ridiculous, she said, her voice rising now. Mark is a friend. A friend. But of course you wouldn't understand that, would you? You're so wrapped up in your little detective world that you can't see what's right in front of you. Maybe if you spent less time obsessing over your past cases and more time paying attention to us, we wouldn't be in this mess. Jeremy felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was good at this, he had to give her that. Twisting the narrative, making him the villain. But he wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. This isn't about my past, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. This is about you, and him, and whatever the hell is going on between you two. Jennifer rolled her eyes, a dismissive gesture that made his blood boil. You're impossible, she said, turning away. I'm not going to keep having this conversation. You're just looking for something that isn't there because you can't handle the fact that maybe, just maybe, you're the problem. She walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor again, leaving Jeremy standing there, the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. He felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, but he refused to let them crush him. He knew what he'd heard. He knew what he'd seen, and he wasn't going to let her rewrite the truth. She could deny it all she wanted, but Jeremy wasn't going to stop until he had answers. Not just for his sake, but for Ethan's too. His son deserved better than this, and so did he. The house smelled faintly of burnt coffee, a scent Jeremy had grown used to over the years. It was always there, lingering in the kitchen like a ghost of mornings gone by. He sat at the dining table, a stack of bills and statements spread out in front of him. Jennifer had always handled the finances, something he trusted her with completely. But now, trust was a word that tasted like ash in his mouth. It started with a missed payment notice, something about a credit card he didn't recognize. At first, he thought it was a mistake, some kind of mix-up. But when he called the bank, the woman on the other end confirmed it was indeed under his name. Jeremy's stomach churned as she read off the charges. High-end restaurants, boutique hotels, spa retreats, places he'd never been to, dates that lined up with Jennifer's so-called girls' weekends. He dug deeper. The statements were hidden in a shoebox at the back of her closet, tucked beneath a pile of scarves she never wore. Jeremy's hands shook as he flipped through them. Charges for men's cologne, designer watches, even a goddamn Peloton bike. All of it tied to Mark's gym. All of it paid for with money Jeremy had worked his ass off to earn. The numbers didn't lie. Thousands of dollars spent on dinners at places Jeremy couldn't even pronounce, let alone afford. Weekend getaways to coastal towns he'd only seen on postcards. And then there were the flights, short, frequent trips to cities just far enough away to feel like another world. It wasn't just the money, though. It was the audacity. The way Jennifer had spun this web of deceit right under his nose, using their shared life as a cover for her double life. Jeremy's chest tightened as he stared at the receipts. One in particular caught his eye, a reservation for 2 at a vineyard. The date was last Valentine's Day. He remembered that day vividly. Jennifer had come home late, claiming she'd been stuck at work. She'd brought him a bottle of wine as an apology, something cheap and forgettable. He'd opened it, poured her a glass, and listened to her talk about her day. All the while, she'd been sipping on something far more expensive with Mark. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Jeremy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to smash something, to confront her right then and there. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, the scent of burnt coffee grounding him. This wasn't just about emotions anymore. It was about proof. Cold, hard, undeniable proof. He started compiling everything, every receipt, every statement, every charge. He made copies, organized them into folders, and labeled them with meticulous precision. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the sheer disrespect. Jennifer had taken everything he'd worked for and turned it into a playground for her and Mark. And now Jeremy was going to make sure she paid for it. As he worked, a strange calm settled over him. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the end for Jennifer, and the start of something new for him. He didn't know what that looked like yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not this time. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. Jeremy sat at the small desk in the spare room, the one Jennifer had always called his office, though it was really just a dumping ground for old case files and forgotten paperwork. The room smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee, a scent that clung to the stacks of manila folders and yellowed legal pads piled around him. A single lamp cast a harsh, angled light across the desk, illuminating the chaos. He hadn't touched these files in years. Not since he retired. Back then, he'd packed them away with a sense of finality, thinking he'd never need to open them again. But here he was, sifting through the past, each folder a ghost of a case he'd once solved. His fingers brushed over the edges of the papers, the texture rough under his skin. He paused on one file, pulling it out from the stack. It was thick, the corners dog-eared, the label faded but still legible. Henderson versus State. A domestic dispute turned violent. He remembered it now. The husband, a meticulous planner, had kept a detailed log of his wife's infidelity. Every text, every phone call, every hotel receipt. It had been enough to bury her in court. Jeremy's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages, the words blurring in front of his eyes. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when the numbness had started to give way to something sharper, something colder. Maybe it was when Ethan had told him about the hotel. Or maybe it was when he'd found the credit card statements, the ones Jennifer had tried so hard to hide. The numbers didn't lie. Neither did the dates. She'd been spending money on Mark for months. Luxury hotels, expensive dinners, gifts that Jeremy had never seen. And all while he'd been sitting here, in this house, thinking everything was fine. The anger came in waves now, hot and sudden, like a flare of pain. He'd never been the kind of man who lost control, but this was different. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about humiliation, about being made to feel small, foolish, like some clueless old man who couldn't see what was right in front of him. He'd spent his entire career uncovering lies, peeling back layers of deceit to get to the truth. And yet, here he was, blindsided by his own wife. He leaned back in the chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in. He glanced at the clock on the desk. 2:47 a.m. Jennifer had gone to bed hours ago, her soft snores drifting down the hallway. He'd listened to them for a while, half expecting to hear something else. A whispered phone call, the sound of a car pulling up outside. But there was nothing, just silence. His eyes fell back to the case file in front of him. The husband in that case, Henderson, had been methodical. He'd waited, gathered evidence, built his case piece by piece until there was no way his wife could deny it. Jeremy had admired that at the time. It wasn't about revenge, he'd told himself. It was about justice. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. Justice? What a joke. There was no justice in this. No courtroom, no judge, no jury. Just him, sitting in this dimly lit room, surrounded by the remnants of a life that wasn't his anymore. But maybe he didn't need a courtroom. Maybe all he needed was the truth. The kind of truth that couldn't be laughed off or gaslit away. He reached for a fresh legal pad, the kind he used to use for case notes, and clicked a pen. The ink was dry at first, and he had to scribble in the margin to get it flowing. When it did, he started writing. A list. Dates, times, places. Everything he could remember. Everything he'd found. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it, but he knew this much. He wasn't going to sit here and let her rewrite the story. Not this time. The clock ticked on, the minutes stretching into hours. Jeremy didn't notice. He was too busy digging through the past, pulling it apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. And when he finally leaned back, the first light of dawn creeping through the blinds, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not anger, not sadness, determination. Jennifer had underestimated him, and that, he realized, was her first mistake. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if even the walls knew something was coming. Jeremy sat in his study, the faint hum of the surveillance equipment buzzing in the background like a distant storm. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, a scent that had become his constant companion over the past few weeks. He'd set up the cameras and microphones himself, meticulously placing them where Jennifer and Mark wouldn't think to look, behind the potted fern in the living room, inside the hollow base of the antique lamp, even tucked into the bookshelf where the spines of old case files stared back at him like silent witnesses. He didn't sleep much anymore. Nights were spent hunched over the monitor, watching grainy footage of his own home, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally show itself. He'd become a stranger in his own life, a shadow moving through the rooms, recording every conversation, every glance, every lie. And then, one evening, it happened. The sound of Jennifer's laughter floated through the speakers, sharp and unfamiliar. Jeremy leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. She was laughing, but not with him. Never with him anymore. Mark's voice followed, low and smug, like he owned the place. Jeremy's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk as he listened. "You really think he'll just let it go?" Mark asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. "The guy's a retired detective, Jen. He's not stupid." Jennifer's response was calm, almost dismissive. "Jeremy's stuck in the past. He spends more time with his old case files than he does with me. Trust me, he won't figure it out." Jeremy's jaw clenched. The words cut deeper than he expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had been stuck in the past, clinging to the ghosts of cases long closed, while the present crumbled around him. But not anymore. The conversation continued, each sentence more damning than the last. They talked about money, his money, and how they'd split it once Jennifer filed for divorce. Mark joked about buying a new car, something flashy to match his ego, while Jennifer chimed in with plans for a luxury vacation. Jeremy's hands trembled as he adjusted the volume, straining to catch every detail. They didn't just want to leave him. They wanted to strip him clean, leaving him with nothing but the memories of their betrayal. The recording ended with the sound of footsteps fading into the distance, followed by the soft click of a door closing. Jeremy sat back in his chair, the weight of what he'd just heard pressing down on him like a physical force. He played it again and then a third time, committing every word to memory. The laughter, the plans, the cold calculation. It was all there, captured in perfect clarity. For the first time in weeks, Jeremy felt something other than anger or despair. He felt clarity. The evidence was undeniable, a smoking gun wrapped in audio waves. He stared at the monitor, the flickering images of his home. Their home, reflected in his tired eyes. The house felt emptier now, not just because of Jennifer's absence, but because of the truth that filled the space between the walls. He reached for the divorce papers he'd already drafted, the ones he'd been too afraid to serve. Not anymore. The recordings were his insurance, his proof that he wasn't the paranoid ex-detective Jennifer painted him to be. He was a man who'd been betrayed, who'd been played for a fool. But he was also a man who knew how to fight back. The storm outside finally broke, rain hammering against the windows as if the sky itself was unleashing its fury. Jeremy sat in the dim light of his study, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the room. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened to the rain and waited for the morning, when the real storm would begin. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. Jeremy sat at the dining table, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. His laptop was open, the screen dimmed to a faint glow, and a small USB drive sat beside it like a silent witness. The faint scent of lemon cleaner lingered in the air, a reminder of Jennifer's obsessive tidiness. He'd always found it comforting, but now it felt like a lie, just another layer of the facade she'd built around their life. When the front door creaked open, Jeremy didn't look up. He heard her heels clicking against the hardwood, the familiar rhythm of her steps. She was humming something, a tune he didn't recognize. He wondered if Mark had put it in her head. "Jeremy?" Her voice carried that false brightness she used when she was trying to hide something. "You're still up." He finally looked up, his face a mask of calm. "Sit down, Jennifer." She hesitated, her smile faltering. She set her purse on the counter and pulled out a chair, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was trying to buy time. "What's going on? You're acting weird." Jeremy slid the stack of papers toward her. "Read it." She glanced at the papers, her brow furrowing. "What is this?" "Evidence," he said, his voice steady, "of your affair with Mark, and your plans to drain our accounts." Her face went pale. She flipped through the papers, her hands trembling. Credit card statements, hotel receipts, screenshots of text messages. Everything laid bare. The USB drive contained audio recordings, her voice unmistakable as she laughed with Mark about how easy it had been to manipulate Jeremy. How they'd take everything and leave him with nothing. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. "You're taking things out of context." Jeremy leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You were recorded, Jennifer. You can't talk your way out of this. Her panic was palpable now, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. You had no right to spy on me. This is insane, Jeremy. You're paranoid. This is just like your stupid cases. You're seeing conspiracies everywhere. He didn't flinch. I'm not the one who got caught. She slammed her hands on the table, her eyes wild. You're going to ruin everything. Do you even care about us? About Ethan? Or are you just obsessed with playing detective again? Jeremy's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. This isn't about playing detective. This is about you betraying me, betraying our family. Jennifer's anger faltered, replaced by desperation. Jeremy, please, I made a mistake. I was lonely. You were always so distant, so wrapped up in your past. I just wanted to feel something. Feel something? He repeated, his tone icy. You could have talked to me. Instead, you chose to lie, to steal, to destroy everything we built. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. I'll end it with Mark. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, Jeremy. Don't throw away 20 years over a stupid mistake. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. It's not a mistake when you plan it, when you laugh about it, when you try to take everything from me. Her tears were flowing now, but Jeremy felt nothing. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd trusted, was gone. All that remained was the truth, cold and unyielding. He picked up the laptop and USB drive, tucking them under his arm. We're done, Jennifer. I'll have the divorce papers sent to you tomorrow. As he walked out of the room, her sobs echoed behind him. But Jeremy didn't look back. He couldn't. The storm had passed, and all that was left was the wreckage. And for the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The truth had set him free, even if it hurt like hell. Jennifer's voice cracked as she stood in the living room, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. The faint smell of her perfume, something floral and expensive, hung in the air, a cruel reminder of the countless nights she'd come home late, always with some excuse about work or errands. Now, standing there in her sleek black dress, she looked smaller somehow, like a paper doll someone had crumpled up and tossed aside. Jeremy, please, she began, her voice quivering. I made a mistake, terrible mistake. But we can fix this. We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away over one stupid moment. Jeremy sat at the dining table, his fingers resting lightly on the manila envelope in front of him. The envelope was crisp, unopened, but he knew exactly what was inside. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering every shred of evidence, every receipt, every recording. The room was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound that had always been there in the background, unnoticed until now. One stupid moment? Jeremy repeated, his voice steady but edged with something sharp. Is that what you call it? Months of lying, sneaking around, spending my money on him. That's just one stupid moment. Jennifer's face twisted, her eyes brimming with tears. She took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I was lonely, Jeremy. You were always so distant, so wrapped up in your work, even after you retired. Mark, he listened to me. He made me feel... She trailed off, her voice breaking. Jeremy's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, hot and volatile, but he kept it in check. He'd spent too many years interrogating suspects to let his emotions get the better of him now. Instead, he reached for the envelope and slid it across the table toward her. I'm filing for divorce, he said, his tone flat and final. Everything is in there. The papers, the evidence, the financial records. I suggest you take it to your lawyer. Jennifer stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. Her hands fluttered uselessly in the air before she finally picked it up, her fingers fumbling with the seal. When she pulled out the stack of papers, her face went pale. You recorded us? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Jeremy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on her face said it all: shock, fear, and something else, something darker. Guilt, maybe, or regret. Jeremy, please, she said again, her voice rising in desperation. Think about Ethan. Think about what this will do to him. He needs us. He needs both of us. At the mention of their son, Jeremy's resolve wavered for just a moment. He pictured Ethan's face, the way he'd looked when he'd confessed what he'd seen at the hotel. The kid had been torn apart, caught between loyalty to his father and love for his mother. But then Jeremy remembered the way Jennifer had laughed with Mark, the way she'd dismissed Ethan's concerns as if they were nothing. "Ethan deserves better," Jeremy said, his voice low and firm. "Better than lies. Better than this." Jennifer sank into a chair, the papers spilling out of her hands and scattering across the table. She looked defeated, her shoulders slumped, her makeup smeared. For a moment, Jeremy almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'll give you until the end of the week to find a place to stay," he said, standing up from the table. "After that, I don't want to see you here again." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jennifer sitting there in silence. The faint sound of her crying followed him down the hall, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap, sharp and bracing. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Jeremy stood on the porch for a long time, staring up at the stars, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The rain tapped softly against the window of Jeremy's new apartment, a sound that had become both a comfort and a reminder of the storm he'd weathered. He sat at the small dining table, a half-empty coffee mug in front of him, steam curling into the air. The apartment was sparse, but it was his. No Jennifer, no lies, no constant ache in his chest that felt like a weight he'd been carrying for years. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall where a single framed photo hung, a picture of him and Ethan from a fishing trip years ago. His son had been his rock through all of this, the one person who hadn't betrayed him, the one person who'd stood by him when the world seemed to crumble. Ethan's voice echoed in his mind from their last conversation. "You're better off without her, Dad. You always were." Jeremy's fingers drummed lightly on the table, a habit he'd picked up during his years as a detective, always thinking, always processing. He thought about the case files he'd pored over, the surveillance footage, the late nights spent piecing together the truth. It had all led him here, to this quiet moment of clarity. Jennifer was gone, and with her, the toxicity that had seeped into every corner of his life. The credit card statements, the secret trips, the laughter he'd overheard, it was all behind him now. But it wasn't just about Jennifer. It was about him. For years, he'd let her gaslight him, let her twist his reality until he doubted himself at every turn. He'd been so focused on playing the role of the dutiful husband, the retired detective, that he'd forgotten who he was. Now, sitting in this small apartment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The rain outside picked up, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the cadence of his thoughts. He thought about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. It excited him. He could rebuild. He could start over. Jeremy stood and walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. The man looking back was different, older, yes, but stronger. The lines on his face told a story of pain and resilience, of a man who'd been knocked down but refused to stay there. He thought about the day he'd confronted Jennifer, the cold detachment in his voice as he handed her the divorce papers. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't cried. He'd simply stood there, unmovable, like a rock in a storm. And when she tried to manipulate him, tried to twist the narrative one last time, he'd held firm. The memory brought a small, bitter smile to his lips. Jennifer had always underestimated him, always thought she could outmaneuver him. But in the end, she'd been the one who'd lost. She'd lost him. She'd lost the life they'd built together. And now, she was just a footnote in his story. A painful chapter, but one he'd closed for good. Jeremy turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the small stack of books he'd started reading. Novels he'd always meant to get to but never had the time for. He picked one up, thumbing through the pages, the smell of ink and paper grounding him. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step forward. A reminder that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about living. He sat back down at the table, the rain still tapping softly against the window. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. Jennifer was gone, but he wasn't. And that was enough. For now, it was more than enough.